The Revolt of the Angels by Anatole, France. I believe it's pronounced just France, but I think like the C is silent, so it'd be like the consonant of some consonant would be silent, to be like France. Anatole France. I think that would be the faithful French, but I probably wasn't anywhere near. But yeah, so yeah, this took a while for me to get to. As far as viewing it, I did finish it. I mean, about a month ago, but it took me a while to kind of work up the gall to want to review it, just because I felt like so many other people on YouTube particularly did it justice already, in that there's nothing really I can add to it. But then again, a lot of the stuff I do, pretty much all the books I happen to like, whether it's John Williams or like Butcher's Crossing or Stoner, like those had pretty big reviews for it. Like people, many favorites or people, or stuff with Cormac McCarthy or Virginia Woolf. I mean, it doesn't, just because these are big names doesn't mean that I shouldn't, that I might not have something to add to it. But maybe that's also a bit of a gall, of a little bit of a ballsy thing to say, I guess, lack of a better word, to say like, ooh, I have so many good things to say, but I will try to have something. So one of the reasons why this took a while for me to get through is probably the print. At first I thought it was like, oh, well, I thought there was nothing deceptively, I thought, but the print threw me off, because it's like here. I don't know if you can see that, but it was just probably not focusing right, but yeah, it just felt like just a little bit too. It's by this Forgotten Books place. I don't know, not to harp on them too much, but the Forgotten Books, like printing, they have classic reprint series. But I do wish that the paragraph breaks were like a little bit less clunky, and the type seems like, for the book size, seems a little bit too big, I think. But maybe I'm just too used to reading a smaller font, especially like the older Penguin classics and stuff. But anyway, so yeah, so The Revolt of the Angels by Anatole France. The author Anatole France lived from 1844 to 1924 and he wrote this in 1914. So he would have been about 70 when this came out, and this is over 100 years ago. So it's an old book, and right around the time of Kafka, right? He's like, although Kafka is still kind of in the unknown, kind of unsung heroes of the literary world, and then doesn't really kind of burgeoning into fame until well after he passes away. And France was already an established author by that time. He didn't just come out of nowhere. He was a really, really, really highly revered and respected poet, and man of letters too in France too. And so I think the main thing with him was that he wrote, I think it was like Chase something, there was another thing. Penguin Island, yes, is another one that I have on my list. And I'm not too sure what that's about. I think it's a little bit more, a less kind of more thematic and less otherworldly than this, and it's more centered around like the real world, but I could be wrong. So this is concerning the Revolt. It's very much came in the vein of John Milton's Paradise Lost. In fact, there's actually a word-for-word quote that they give of it's better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven, taken from it's the Satan of John Milton's Paradise Lost, which came out a good 300 years-ish before. I want to say Milton was lived from, I'm going to butcher this, but some possibly early-ish 1600s to like mid to late 1600s, but I'm not too sure. He wasn't too long after Shakespeare. I know him and Chaucer kind of were such notable kind of historical figures that they actually changed kind of the English language as a whole. I think they've given it's definitely Shakespeare, but I think with obviously Chaucer was earlier then, so it's like so I think with Anatole France is that he wrote this as a kind of satire, and it's basically retelling the Revolt in Heaven of obviously the namesake, and how the Angel Arcade kind of leads this Gnostic. There's lots of Gnostic kind of references to Yalda Ba'oth, who is the false kind of demiurge that that also William Blake would have mentioned. Kind of, Urizen is almost like a kind of continuation of that. But I've yet to read all of the Book of Urizen just yet. But yeah, I'm trying to roll through William Blake's collection too, and I've read some collections of his poetry, some shorter stuff. But yeah, so the Angel Arcade is kind of so it starts out talking right off the bat. I like to give it a little taste of the book. So it starts out talking about Maurice Esparviu, Esparviu, I think that's what it is, D'Esparviu, and it talks about his kind of the genealogy of his family name, and going back all the way to around so it starts out concerning in the few lines of the history of the French family from 1789 to the present day. So 1789, skip forward like a century and a half, and you get present day. So beneath the shadow of Saint Sulpice in the ancient mansion of the Esparviu family rears its austere 3 stories between the moss-grown forest and a garden hemmed in the years have lapsed, and even loftier from the intrusive buildings, wherein nevertheless 2 tall chestnut trees still lift up their withered heads. So I thought that was an interesting kind of sample of France's kind of I want to say, I don't want to demean and call it flowery language, because Nietzsche wrote kind of in a similar kind of flowery kind of, and one might accuse me for writing worse, obviously, but, obviously not nearly as good, obviously, but, I think it's not that there's, it's stylistic in a sense, and Dostoevsky's a little bit similar like that. It's very, almost indifferently so, and that's not a bad thing, I don't think. I think, it gives it's like it's starting out kind of very the whole thing is quite tongue-in-cheek. It's like talking about the Esparviu family and Maurice and how he's kind of going around, and he's and right about 100 pages in, it takes a little while for it to get into the business of the angels. And at first I thought, going into it, usually I go into books not really knowing much. I like to kind of keep it that way, just in case I stumble on any spoilers. But yeah, so going into this, I didn't know that for all I knew, the Revolt of the Angels could have just been a figurative kind of metaphor, but it actually turns out that the angels are real. I don't know what you want to call that, magic realism. I don't know what you call it. If it's like Thomas Mann, where it's like with Adrian Leverkin and like Dr. Faustus, where like the disease, the demon in Dr. Faustus, like the kind of Mephisto kind of entity in that, it could actually be just a kind of metaphorical kind of thing on syphilis, and the kind of onset of syphilis taking its kind of, when it's planted in the brain, and like how awful that happens, and how when it, but in this, I don't think this is, I don't think it's like figurative at all. It's just talking about, the angels are actually there, in person. They're fleshly beings that they have, he talks about them having wings that are kind of, there's a name that he used in kind of an etymological word that kind of reminded me of a Nabokov quote, but but they, the angel is quite, it takes like, so 87, it's like Arcade starts talking, there is no Yaldabaoth, there is God. Come, Arcade, do the right thing. Renounce these follies, these impieties. Disincarnate yourself. Become once more a pure spirit and resume the office of the guardian angel. So yeah, that's, okay, so that was Maurice talking, I believe. So throughout the whole entire thing, Maurice is basically getting himself in a lot of different kind of follies and different affairs with women, and he's kind of an impure kind of guy. He's not really living in, a faithful, like, spiritual life. He gives like France gives like a pretty detailed kind of tracing back of history and chronology of his family, and how like they've given such a good amount of astute observations, like, observing all the holidays and all the saintly things. And then Maurice here is like a kind of fool, a kind of almost holy fool, because he's stuck in kind of like these circuitous relationships that don't last, and like with Madame d'Aubals, I think her name is, and is one of them, and she's kind of getting tired of it too, and he's at an age where he should really just kind of mature up. And this is what leads the Angel Arcade when he shows up on page 87 or so, my version, and he shows up and he's like completely disenfranchised with everything. Like he's like been waiting. He's supposed to be Maurice's guardian angel, and Arcade ends up spending all his days stuck in a library. And this is the part where I was funny, because where I was almost laughing out loud, lending it some humor. Obviously, the whole book has this kind of tone of it, kind of a absurd, kind of ridiculous tone, in a good way. He's Maurice is failed him, and he's like the guardian angel is basically spending all his time reading in a library. Surrounding himself in books, and he reads all the philosophies and the humanities, exhausting every last book, available in that space, and he's like become totally disillusioned with God, and he realizes after reading a history and all the stuff of like the ancient saints and stuff, and like probably I'd imagine the Gnostics too, although I don't know if he mentions any of them by name, but possibly like the Nag Hammadi or the Nos Hassans, the texts of like even like Thoth, dating back as far as like Thothian Egypt, or the Thoth period of Egypt, all these ancient kind of esoteric texts, and I'd imagine that's kind of what Arcade has been reading, and now he's kind of thinking that, okay, so the world is false, and like it's been created by a false demiurge, Yaldabaoth, and he's renounced to that, and he's like, my plan is to meet up with all these other angels, and we're gonna basically, take back, overthrow heaven like Satan did, except this time we're actually gonna be successful at it, and we are going to basically kind of kick Yaldabaoth off, and then the one true God will finally reign again, and this is the true God of the god of the Pleroma, I guess, is that's the kind of the range of I think the Pleroma is like that kind of the heavenly kind of almost Elysian kind of field-esque kind of thing, but it's like the pinnacle, and that's kind of the teleological goal for him. And then this ties us into another character of the gardener, that is. It kind of takes a lot of different. There's a prince that shows up as well. Continuing on with the Revolt of the Angels, as Arcade pilfers around Paris, trying to find other. That's where it's set, by the way. I forgot to mention this is in Paris, set just like the perfume story, in like centered around Paris and kind of on the Axis, kind of returning back to that. But anyway, so Arcade is in dire need of looking for other angels, and he stops by these bars and pubs and whatnot, and he's looking to brew up, like he's seeking them out, and there's a woman angel, her name was like a Czar, it was like Z, it was something, it was like a kind of I think it was Tizar, I think, don't count on me to find it in this, but yeah, it's, so they all bind together, and they're trying to find Satan, Lucifer himself, to go overthrow heaven, obviously, and the false god overriding it, and Lucifer offers them to spend the night at his place, at his pad, just like, hey, casually just like saying, like, you guys can, kick it here tonight, and I don't know why I'm talking all in layman's terms, like, using like all these weird casuistries. But anyway, so Satan is in on it. He's saying, I'll let you know tomorrow morning. So like they're all in like waiting for like what's gonna, very eagerly awaiting his answer, and he answers them finally, and he's saying that basically, one of us is going to overflow. In fact, the quote I think is, "God conquered will become Satan, and Satan conquering will become God. May the fates spare me this terrible lot." So it's like kind of left up in the open, and obviously spoiler alert if you're in this far. But yeah, so France has an interesting way of imbuing Gnosticism into this, but I think the main kind of contention people have is that it's a little bit too almost like like comedy, like fantastical. It's almost like too tongue-in-cheek or satirical. It's hard to take seriously. It's told in like a very sentimental kind of almost maudlin kind of like ooh hoo hoo, like kind of blithering or blasé kind of tone, glib, insouciant, synonyms like that. And it's not, people have accused it of being like not serious enough for the subject matter. I mean, it's talking about an angel that spends hundreds of years cramming his head with theology and and these very great feats, and it's like talking about all this very dramatic stuff, very on over the top stuff, elaborate, heaven, a war in heaven, and it's kind of it does seem like it's not playing. I feel like modernism was in its infancy. It was only just then that James Joyce and others were kind of experimenting. D.H. Lawrence among them, Proust, obviously. But they were experimenting with kind of just, like writing in a way that's not super flowery and ornate. And this is obviously using the medium of him talking like, Arcade objected it was difficult to satisfy the man. They quarreled with the sovereign dispenser of guardian spirits, but he could not be that and nothing of that. It's like, it was a little hard for me to read. I'm sorry. Even though it's probably about 8-hour read, I think. In this version, it's 360, 70 pages. And, that's not, I'm not trying to say that it's all about the length or anything like that. All I'm trying to say is that it's crammed in a fairly kind of average story size or novel size. A lot of these where it's hard to kind of take it seriously, and it's hard to know where the intense kind of tongue-in-cheek kind of satire ends and where if any of it, because he's coming from it, I guess, as a point of view, from my knowledge, limited knowledge, as France's beliefs or lack of beliefs as an atheist, I think, a materialist kind of atheist. And he was a socialist too, politically. He was pretty active in that political scheme of life, especially in the kind of late 1800s, I think. And yeah, he was almost as much as kind of a from what I've imagined, is kind of almost as much as a literary figure as he was a political figure, kind of in trying to kind of what's the word. Rock the boat a little bit of the status quo, but I don't know the particulars, obviously. But but another thing I've heard, this is very just random. I was going to mention this first thing, but I heard that Anatole France's brain was actually extracted after he passed away in 1924 to scientists, because they were very eager, because people had yet to have done the same with Einstein's brain, 3 centuries later, in like 1955, I think he died. But they did this this was at the height of everybody freaking out about brains, and if somebody has, I think it was said about Emile Zola or some Russian, I think there was a Russian writer who they did this with. It was, I can't remember, but it was they were like, oh, if you have a big kind of, a big brainer, that means if you are a highly intellectual person, you are, especially if you kind of combine at a confluence of all these different genres, like you are, say, or you're a Renaissance man too, or woman, then that will mean that your brain is actually heavier. But what actually happened was that they weighed France's brain, and they found out it was actually like a 3/4, even half almost, I believe, the size of the average brain. So it was actually pretty tiny. So that's interesting. And it could have done, it could have been his ode to his size. Maybe he was just a smaller guy, but I'm not sure. But yeah, that's just interesting because it's like it kind of goes against the whole, the kind of the time around the time, I don't want to call it sort of pseudoscience, but this kind of false idea people have of big brain, like having big brains, and this was pervaded for years and years. I mean, even Schopenhauer. Sorry about that. Those were my headphones. Even Schopenhauer kind of dispensed with this phrenology kind of thing of like marrying two like contradictory people, like someone like a woman with a big nose and a woman and a man with a small nose. Obviously, this is kind of a cartoon hyperbole, but like having those like contrasting people, like Mary will create a fairly average person or something. That's kind of obviously shows that's not true science, as at least. But anyway, that is all I have for The Revolt of the Angels by Anatole France, and thank you for watching.